Tonight, we're continuing to explore the extraordinary life of a Middleton descendant named Alice Smith, the authors of a new book, Alice Ravenel Huger Smith, Charleston Renaissance Artist. The publication of this wonderful new book has been a great collaboration between these authors, between Middleton Place Foundation and Evening Post Books. And I'd like to take a moment to thank Evening Post Books. Michael Nolan is here tonight. They're the executive director of Evening Post Books. Thank you so much, Michael, and your team, and for this partnership as well as for sponsoring this event. I'd also like to thank the contributors to this project. Many contributors have supported this important book, but especially Dr. and Mrs. Lewis Wright, who gave some very instrumental and very timely support to this project to really make it happen. And I'm so happy that they're here tonight with us. And a great thank you, big hand for Dr. Wright and Dr. and Mrs. Lewis Wright. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So tonight our speakers are the authors of the book, Dwight McInvaill, Ann Tinker, and Caroline Palmer. Dwight directs the the Georgetown County Library. Sorry, Dwight. When he's not researching, writing, and speaking about Alice Smith. Anne is retired as an international leader in women's and children's health. She spends her time now as a trustee of the Middleton Place Foundation. She's also on the board of the Gibbs Art Museum. Caroline brought some professional experience to this project in communications, marketing, and human resources. Caroline is also a trustee of the Middleton Place Foundation. She has two wonderful daughters, Claire and Alice, and both Caroline and Anne are Middleton descendants and the great and great nieces of Alice Smith, the artist that we'll be talking about. Our moderator tonight is Harlan Greene. Harlan is one of the small handfuls of people that if you're writing a book about Charleston and you haven't consulted with Harlan, you're probably going to miss something. I'd like to know, it'd be fun to know really how many times Harlan has been acknowledged in books about Charleston history topics. He's been a prolific writer in his own right. He's written works of fiction and nonfiction, including things on historic cemeteries, freedmen's cottages, slave badges, and the Charleston Renaissance, which is kind of our focus tonight. So as you can see, we're in good hands for a lively discussion, and I'm very thankful to have Dwight, Caroline, and Ann with us, and I'm going to leave them in the good stewardship of our moderator, Harlan Greene.
Well, thank you, Tracy. Like you said, being an archivist, you get to live vicariously through the work that other people are doing, and it's a great way to kind of, not do all the work, but actually participate in all the fun that they're having. And so I'm glad to be here this evening too. And like many of us, I've been looking forward to this and learning more about Alice Smith. She's intrigued me for years, and I think Middleton Place is the perfect spot for something like this because Middleton meant so much to her. When I was driving out here today, and I'm sure y'all had the experience too, you couldn't help but wonder what it was like in her time, not having to dodge all the other cars and stuff. But in the book, we can actually know what it is about her time because they have a wonderful quote from one of her letters. So something that she wrote probably about 1902. When I was 16, she wrote, my father, my cousin Julian Wells, and I started out walking one day to find a tombstone. I guess it was maybe at St. Andrew's, old St. Andrew's Church. We decided to go further and pushed on to Middleton Place. With my father and cousin, I did 15 miles there and 15 miles back with the good earth and grass growing underfoot. Sometimes we toiled through sand that made us really work every step. However, Middleton Place was beautiful, a jewel thrown down in the green woods. So here in this jewel, on this lovely evening, I'm really looking forward to begin. But beginning, I'll be ungentlemanly, and I'm going to ask the first question of the gentleman here. So Dwight and I are both kind of reference librarians, and our paths have crossed a lot in the past few years, and oftentimes it's been on the issue of Alice Ravenel Huger Smith. So Dwight, it's been a long journey, And how do you feel now that the book is done?
It's been a wonderful journey, and you have the fault of my working on it for the last 10 years, Harlan. You're the man who said that I should cover the first part of her life, and so I've thought about that every day that I've been working on this.
Mea culpa, I apologize.
Mea culpa. But in any case, so Harlan, I'm glad that I did listen to you, and I've had two extraordinary co-authors that have come on board in the last 2 years, and they took what was double the size of what it is now and really made it into a fine book that is focused and just an excellent, visually an excellent book as well. Wanted to share with you a wonderful watercolor, and I know that the Zoom audience will be able to see this, and it's called The Studio After the Duration, Harry in Action. And Alice Smith sent this watercolor to my father when he was on the USS Snatch in the Pacific during World War II. She sent him hundreds of letters. At one point, he received so many letters that he was the envy of the entire fleet. And her letters dealt with, well, it was an accomplished watercolorist talking to an aspiring poet. And so she wrote about what it meant to be an artist, what the price is to be paid for what they casually call the artistic mind, how you needed to drive forward and be persistent. And she also talked about the exuberance of artistic creation. So I'm going to take a sip, and then we're going to read a passage out of one of those letters. 1945. I think I expected to paint everything lovely I saw. I know I wanted to, but I never painted all I wished. How could I? I cannot tell you how often I used to fight sleep so that I could imagine the great birds sweeping down in the light over the sea, over the trees, crossing the moon, lit by the sun, or the small birds playing with the flowers, or the depths of the pine woods, or the depths of the swamps with the moss and the lilies. The length of her letters averaged 6 pages each, 400 of them in the South Carolina Historical Society. Magnificent work. Again, I discovered these in a cabin in the woods near my parents' home in Conway, South Carolina, along with sketchbooks, photographs, business records, 15 boxes of archival materials, and I have yet to go through them all. It's been a wonderful journey, and Harlan was there at the beginning as well, because he's the one who was at the South Carolina Historical Society when I took the letters to him. And so it's just been an extraordinary inheritance, and I'm so glad that this happened. And it happened because of World War II, her generosity and opening up her house and her sister Caroline to the troops. Again, just a wonderfully, wonderfully generous person. And while she was sending letters to my dad in the Pacific, she was teaching my mom watercolor lessons. And when they became separated, she wrote them. And so in these letters, you can see how she painted, which is wonderful. Looking at Jonathan Green right now, the famous artist of the Low Country, I know that he knows what I'm talking about. You know, that this is the essence when someone shares with you their secrets, their passion, and how they accomplish such things. I'm quitting now because I was told I only have 4 minutes. Thank you very much.
But in the book, I don't know, I think all your voices meld. And in the book, you can read, you know, the wonderful relationship between Miss Alice and Dwight's family and how he came along to this treasure chest of materials there too. So, you know, in that respect, you got this inheritance, but and you even got a more direct inheritance too. You actually was your great aunt. You actually knew her. And can you tell us about what your experience was and what it meant to you to be involved in this book?
Well, Harlan, as Dwight has told us, he really has worked for a decade on researching and writing this book, and he deserves great credit for that. We have been in touch over the last decade as he was writing his book. I read quite a few manuscripts, but 2 years ago he came to Caroline and myself and said he'd really like us to be co-authors to help edit the book, to add some of the family perspective, and also to help it towards publication. So It's really been a great team and a labor of love together. I did know Alice. She was my great aunt, and I grew up in the north, but every spring my family spent 2 weeks here because both of my parents had roots in Charleston. And we always stayed with Aunt Alice and her older sister Caroline at 69 Church Street. We always went out to Middleton Place when we were here, and Middleton Place meant a lot to her. She did a lot of her sketches and paintings here. And I remember at dinner, actually, in the dining room, which is now in the House Museum, with J.J. Pringle Smith and his wife, when they lived here long before Charles Dewell became the inherited Middleton Place, and it became the beautiful gardens and place it is now. The other place that I think of when I think of Alice is a patch of beautiful woodsy land on the Wando River, which we called River Bend. And my father had bought this in the 1920s. And Alice and we would go out for picnics, and we'd roast oysters and swim and walk. And Alice did many sketches and paintings there. My favorite painting was one she did of the woods on the Wando River there. And she also did some unusual pieces of work. They were panels of mahogany, which she painted with oil, some of them 5 feet tall. And they were hanging in the little cabin on this property until they ended up in our house in Massachusetts not too long ago.
That's and in the book too, and I wish I could have written those down too. Alice Smith, she talks about getting out into the woods, literally into the waters, into the woods and stuff like that, to bring those beautiful visions back. And a word I've heard a lot so far is inheritance. You know, we've got this great inheritance of beauty and of art from her, but Caroline too. So you certainly have an inheritance from her. You didn't know her personally, did you? But did you grow up, you know, hearing about her, you know, have any image in your own mind of her?
I did. I grew up with her art on the walls of our house. And so I always admired her. And I actually developed an early interest in drawing and painting. And I majored in art history. So I would say, you know, I always sort of was in awe of her, but it wasn't until moving to Charleston and working on this book that I got to know just how pioneering she was and how much a part of Charleston's story she was. I mean, she was a big part of Charleston's history. And so being able to appreciate that and learn more about her, and also learn more about my hometown, because it was about 3 years ago that I moved with my family to Charleston and I left my corporate job. So it's been a huge pleasure to be able to use some of my skills from the business world on such a meaningful project. And I think, you know, we are really proud of the way the book has turned out. So it's been a terrific collaboration.
Yeah, and again, it's sort of like the way she melded the watercolors and rolled them around on the page and got these beautiful images. I think you all have done the same thing in the book too. And now that we've talked a little bit about your experience with it, can I switch to you, Anne, and maybe tell a little bit about, you know, a little bit for those of us who, you know, have not read the book, a little bit about her biography, what she lived through, and maybe the early parts of her life.
Sure. It's amazing to think what Alice did live through. She was born a decade after the Civil War, and she survived the collapse of the Southern economy, the terrible Jim Crow era, some of the worst hurricanes, earthquakes, and fires in U.S. history, the Great Depression, the Spanish flu of 1918, and 2 world wars. So that's quite a trajectory of experience and U.S. history. I have a few slides to show you. This is Alice as a young girl, and on the right is a sketch she did of her house at 69 Church Street before the piazza was removed by later owners. When Alice was growing up, it was a very full house. There were 16 family members living together there. The house was in our family for 100 years. Alice and her sister Caroline lived there all their lives. Caroline lived to be 100. And it's actually now for sale from the current owners. The next slide shows her grandmother on the left. She was a widow at 27 with 6 children. Her husband was killed in the Civil War. Her mother, shown in the middle, suffered from severe anemia, hardly ever left her room, and died when Alice was 12. Her father, Daniel Elliott Huger Smith, is pictured on the right, and he and Alice collaborated in several books together. Her grandmother and grandfather had prospered from antebellum rice production and viewed the past with nostalgia. Culturally, they looked to England and France for inspiration and lived in accordance with a strict hierarchy of race, class, and gender. Alice's closest siblings were her older sister Caroline and her older brother Mason, who was my grandfather. He lived in New York, but visited often and helped to finance the house on Church Street. Alice also visited him in New York and at his family summer home in Massachusetts. When Alice was growing up, money was short. Charleston was dilapidated. Alice wrote in her memoirs that there was so very little money that one looked on both sides of 1 cent piece and then did not spend it. What money the family had went to college tuition for her brothers, who then moved north to try to make a decent living. Alice had an interest in art, so the decision about her future came early. At the age of 10, her grandmother told her she would need to learn to earn a living and that she was to be an artist. Her sister Caroline became a piano teacher. The next slide. Alice attended Miss Sass's School for Girls for academic instruction. This is a sketch she did of the gate to 23 McGree Street, where the school was located. In the afternoons, from age 12 to 19, she studied at the Carolina Art Association, later to become the Gibbs Museum of Art. In this photo, Alice is seated center right with a paintbrush raised in her right hand. Her French teacher, Lucie Louise Ferry, taught Alice the fundamentals of drawing and painting and introduced her to the Impressionists and the Barbizon School. By the time she was 20, she had begun her professional art career. The next slide shows how she began in order to make what money she could to buy her supplies. She started with little place cards, painted fans, and bright sketches of African-American street vendors, which were popular with affluent northern tourists who found Charleston colorful and exotic. Then in 1902, she had the opportunity to spend a summer in New York, where she took lessons with Cecile Payan and learned miniature portrait painting. She painted miniature portraits in watercolor on thin discs of ivory, as her great-great-uncle Charles Fraser had. He was renowned in the early 19th century for his miniature portraits of prominent Americans. These were valued as personal mementos of loved ones before photography was invented. When Alice returned home, she spent the next 10 years producing and selling miniatures, as well as at least 26 full-size portraits. On the right is a portrait Alice painted herself at age 32. It looks like oil, but it's actually watercolor. 5 years ago, Dwight found out that this self-portrait was up for sale at an auction in Columbia. We felt it belonged in the family. So off I went to the Charlton Hall auction house in Columbia and bravely bought it.
Well, that's great, returning our cultural inheritance back here. And Caroline, forgive me so are you named after Alice's sister, Caroline?
Yes.
I think so. I mean, Alice's mother was also Caroline.
Several
So there's a lot of
Carolines.
Carolines in the
Yeah.
family.
So Anne's got us to about 1910 or 1915 or so, you know, the war period and stuff. Can you tell us how her career takes off after that, and then what happens to her after she's maybe not focusing on portraits in her major phase?
Sure. Well, I can talk about some of the major influences on her art and on her style. She took advantage of learning from artists who traveled through Charleston for the winters. And one of those was Burge Harrison. Harrison was a tonalist painter who, excuse me, he and his wife were staying at the Villa Margarita, but he wasn't able to paint very easily there. So Alice and her family invited him to use one of their kitchen buildings or part of their kitchen building to paint. And so he sort of mentored Alice starting in 1908 for the next 2 decades. And he was of the style, the tonalist style, which emerged in the 1880s when American artists began to paint landscapes with an overall tone of colored atmosphere or mist. And the work on the left of this slide is a pastel that Harrison did of Charleston Harbor. You can see the atmospheric technique and the limited muted palette. Tonalist painters emphasized mood and shadow. You know, they often did even moonlit scenes. And Alice clearly absorbed this in her art. Her art became more subjective, abstract, and evocative as a result. One of the paintings that is on this slide, Clearing the Woods at Dean Hall Plantation, shows that influence. You can see how thoroughly wet her method was on the right side of the painting to suggest the smoke and the burning of the debris kind of amongst the trees. Around 1909, Alice's distant cousin, Mott Alston Reed, came to Charleston, and he would prove to be a very big influence on Alice. He went by Alston, and Alston moved to Charleston after being a professor at Harvard, and he was a huge collector of Asian books, texts about Asian art and Japanese woodblock prints. He introduced her to the Japanese aesthetic and techniques and artists, which really proved to be a huge influence on her style. She learned about Chinese landscape philosophies and Japanese methods and aesthetics. And throughout her career, her strongest work reveals those influences. And on this slide, you can see a striking similarity between Hiroshige's print of a bird and Alice's watercolor painting called Peacock on a Live Oak Bough at Middleton Place. Alice fell in love with Alston, and they likely would have gotten married if he hadn't suffered so badly from rheumatoid arthritis. So while he was an influence in her life for the next 11 years, sadly, he passed away after that. But with Alston's encouragement and the encouragement of Helen Hyde, a printmaker visiting from Chicago, Alice experimented with woodblock printing herself. She created a handful of beautiful original prints, including the 2 you see here, Moonflower and Hawk Moth and Moonlight on the Cooper River. Without a doubt, studying Japanese prints with Alston and the hands-on experience of cutting and inking her own woodblock prints had a really profound effect on Alice. She began to use different compositional methods, often using a vertical format and sometimes employing the concepts of negative space and asymmetrical designs. And a reverence for nature also shines through in so much of her work. When Alston died in 1920, Alice was about 44, and she took a pause from producing art for a little while. Decades later, she wrote something about all of this experimentation she'd done in different mediums. She said, "My hard work in different mediums, for it was more than experimenting, brought great richness into my life. And the fact that it was in so many respects a voyage of discovery added to the breathless interest. The 1920s and 30s, the time between the world wars, were really important for Alice and for Charleston. She was entering a more mature artistic phase, and she was really kind of blending the French academic traditions and then the influences of tonalism and Japanese woodblock prints to create her own really individual style. She wrote in her memoirs that her father guided her back from woodblock prints to watercolors. And so during this period, from that point forward, really, she created the most masterful watercolors, some of which you can see on this slide. She established a studio at 8 Atlantic Street. That became her home base for about 20 years. And you can see a painting of that on the left with garden gates with wisteria. She was at the center of a movement in the 1920s and 30s, later called the Charleston Renaissance. And this cultural reawakening of the city between the world wars helped nurture the city's economic recovery, and it brought national attention to the region. Other well-known artists of the time were Elizabeth O'Neill Verner, who Alice mentored, and Anna Hayward Taylor and Alfred Huddy. Alice gained a reputation for herself as a successful professional artist, and she was deeply involved in Charleston's artistic community. So you can see an image here of her in her studio, which I love because she's looking to the side. But anyway, that's a little bit about that period of her life.
Yeah, and these illustrations, they're just sumptuous in the book, and the colors, you know, I marveled at the colors that she managed to get, but I think the printing of the book has just, you know, really rendered them justice. And, you know, and the Charleston Renaissance is something that I've done research on, but Dwight, let's brag a little bit about what research librarians like us can do. You've done so much work looking into her, other things that influenced her as well. Can you share with us too some things that you've learned in your 10 years? Sorry, I put you on that long trek, but that 10 years of scholarship that, you know, that you've discovered about her.
Well, thank you again for putting me on that path, number one. And number two, the path has been a very rich one. I've gone from coast to coast looking for things, and I should have stayed home because I found what I needed to find at the Gibbs Museum of Art. And that was a wonderful cache of materials. But first, I want to share with you slide number 1 out of 5. And I think we all know that Alice Smith was a researcher on rice cultivation. Now, she has been faulted, and justifiably so, for not including anything on the pain that African Americans suffered. And that is a failing. And so that is something to know, that she did romanticize things, and she was looking backwards, and she was showing what her father had told her and taught her. And so it's to recognize that. But she also was very much interested in the process of rice cultivation and in the people who did the work. And both of these works are different. A Woman Rice Planter that came out in 1913 is far more realistic as far as seeing the images of the African Americans than Carolina Rice Plantation in the 50s, which is more romantic, and that came out in 1936, but it's illustrations of a very romantic narrative as well in the book. So she was, as an illustrator, as Harlan has pointed out, mirroring the actual works that she was representing. And so that's one truth in her illustrative technique. But I thought that I knew everything about Alice Smith when I was at this stage of writing the book before I went to the Gibbs. And she had told my mother that it was okay to take photographs and to use them. And that should have been a clue to me, but I was clueless, all right? And when I went to the Gibbs, I just finished reading A Woman Rice Planter. And Sarah Arnold, the curator there, pulled out a sheaf of photographs, and she said, Dwight, you might want to take a look at these. And I opened them up, and they were the source material for both A Woman Rice Planter and a Carolina Rice Plantation in the 50s. No one has ever mentioned this before. And it was breathtaking because I was able to look, as we can see in the next photograph, at a photograph that Alice had taken. and that in an illustration she did for a woman rice planter. And again, she would write on the back of the photographs who they were by. And so we have a record for genealogists in the future to take a look at. They can identify people from that time. To move on to the next photo, the mill in a barn. This is on a Carolina rice plantation in the 50s. Here she's taken 3 different photographs and put them together to create this work. And I think she used a 4th photograph as well. Again, she was cutting edge because photography was something new when she was using it to do these photographs at the beginning of the 20th century. And she used this cache of photographs throughout her entire career. The next slide, please. Here we have Rhea Wetters. Some of you may recognize this photograph. It's on the cover of Black Rice. It's not ever attributed to Alice Smith because nobody knew, and nobody knew who Rhea Wetters was either, but Alice carefully listed her name on the back of the photograph. And you know, she was probably from the South Santee. I have about 30 seconds left. Let's take a look at the next image, please. She also used sketchbooks, and this is from sketchbook number 1 of Wapula, the Hayward's home on the Cooper River. And she captured these beautiful sketches. She did several pages in which she captured 50 images of the hand milling of rice. She was looking at it, trying to figure out exactly what was done in capturing it for us. And again, I think someday somebody needs to do a book on the sketchbooks of Alice Ravenel Huger Smith. That is a veritable treasure trove waiting to be uncovered. Thank you.
Well, I love being an MC. I'm terrifying people with my watch. So thanks for doing that. But we do have more ground to cover. So we talked about the influences on her. Burge Harrison, the photographs, the actual people that she met, you know, on Patience Pennington's or, you know, at Shakora Wood. But now, Caroline, can you talk about maybe influences that she herself and her father had, you know, on the city itself, specifically historic preservation?
Sure. So in 1914 and 1917, Alice co-authored 2 books with her father that celebrated Charleston's historic architecture. The first was called 20 Drawings of the Pringle House. It's also known as the Miles Bruton House, and it's located at 27 King Street. She did 20 drawings of the exterior and the interior of that residence, which was where Susan Pringle Frost was residing, her cousin. 3 years later, in 1917, she did what would be more of a seminal work, a survey of domestic architecture from the 18th and 19th centuries of Charleston. She used her pencil sketches of various Charleston buildings as the starting point for the 58 drawings she did for the book. And she and her father produced this in 1917 at kind of a key moment when there was an emerging preservation movement in the city. You know, Charlestonians were watching kind of some of the buildings either, you know, being completely neglected or destroyed. And so this book, The Dwelling Houses of Charleston, really inspired pride among local citizens to try to protect some of the architecture that they took for granted and were kind of living amongst. And so the book in part helped inspire the formation of the Society for the Preservation of Old Dwellings in 1920. That's now the Preservation Society of Charleston. And it was founded by Alice's cousin, Susan Pringle Frost, who you just heard about because she was the resident of the Pringle House. And the book really stimulated these efforts to rescue a lot of historic structures. And it also really prompted Charleston to be the first in the nation when in 1931, it established a historic district with regulatory controls. And it served as a model for really the country. So that was something pretty astounding that she and her father helped to do for Charleston.
Yes. And now, you know, with the heavy mantle of being the moderator, I have to now start segueing and moving away. And with some sense of sadness, I'd like to quote her epitaph, which now that I've read the book, I know it's from a verse by English poet Walter Savage Landor. And And Anne, I'm going to toss this one to you. The epitaph reads, "Nature I loved, and next to nature, art." Can you say why that is so wonderfully fitting for her?
Well, nature and art were her great passions in life. She was intrepid. You know, she would walk through marshes and swamps, and she'd, you know, not even bother with the alligators. She was very, very brave and loved the swamps and the marshes and the birds. She was a real, she revered all the water birds, the herons, the ibis, the egrets. And maybe I can show you a couple of slides now of some of her works. This is on the left. I think these both capture, you know, sort of the mystical spirit and unique beauty that she saw in the Low Country. In the painting on the left, you see the slender cypress trees, which are merging with the murky reflections in the swamp. In contrast, front and center is a focal point, a finely drawn, delicate flower, a sky blue wild iris, reaching out of the dark, deep, and mysterious swamp. On the right is a painting titled "The Quiet Pool," which shows wonderful depth and dimension as the eye is drawn back into the forest of cypress trees. And then in the front, on the lower left and the upper right, you see in the foreground these beautiful herons, one standing on a lily pad and the other one about to alight. Then you could turn off the slide now, thanks. She was also really quite a naturalist and was very interested in nature conservation. And an example of that is a book she wrote in 1912 for her nephew and two nieces, one of whom was my mother, about how the herons and the egrets and other wild birds were being extinguished by development and by hunters. And we actually lightly edited a book which she had written for her family, but we have published it 4 years ago, and I think you can still find it at the gift shop at Middleton Place. But just to read you one short piece from there, she talks about the white snowy heron and the great white egret. There used to be thousands so lovely and white, with their beautiful plumes like spun glass in the light, with their black bills and legs showing clear against the sky. They would rise in white clouds if you chanced to pass by. But seeking for trimmings for hat shops in town, men with guns from great cities have shot them all down. Now on this island, where there used to be many, in a very few years, there may not be any. So some men who live here in our own Charleston city, thinking this is a cruel and terrible pity, have bought Heron Island, and so there is yet a chance of their saving the hunted egret. So she really was very, nature and art was definitely, and she was a poet, as you could see from that.
That's so wonderful. She could see in her own life how things were changing, and you all three have mentioned this. And maybe with the final question or so for the panel, maybe direct to you, Caroline. How has our views of her shifted over the years? Her artworks are these beautiful moments of eternity and beauty in time, but time has gone on. So can you talk a little bit how she is now viewed, maybe, you know, with the passage of time?
Sure. Well, I think, you know, one thing that my mom alluded to was this sense of nostalgia that's really kind of a big part of some of her work. And so I think, you know, she grew up kind of looking to the past and the faded glory of Charleston and her family's former wealth. And I think that really influenced the way she saw the world around her. And so I think, over the course of time, we've become to see her as a complicated figure with, flaws in some of her views and some of the prevailing views of society, but also as an accomplished professional who documented rice planting as it was in its dying days when no one else did. And so I think we've had a lot of really interesting conversations over the past few years about how to portray a complicated figure in an era when not all voices were heard. And so it's been kind of a journey of discovery for us about how to think about someone in the past from our current lens. And so I think we've tried our best in the book to kind of reflect on her achievements, but also acknowledge some of the injustices of the era and of the time in which she lived.
Yeah, from an objective point of view, I think y'all all have succeeded with that. And, I keep toying with the, it's beauty and truth. I think the book strikes this incredible beauty, but you also have this great scholarly integrity to it as well. And I think that's an incredible balance to do. And yes, I read all of those footnotes and they're just wonderful. We've got maybe one last question, Dwight. Can you tell us the choice of the cover of the book? It is just exquisite.
It's a beautiful work. She gave that to my parents as a wedding present. And it was upstairs in her drawing room at 69 Church Street with a companion one called After the Storm at Folly Beach. And that will soon be displayed at the Florence County Museum, and the Lotus in the Great Lake Reserve is in the Middleton Place Museum. And so if you want to see it, that's where you should go. It's well worth seeing. I miss it terribly.
Yeah. Well, we would love to hear your questions now. And I think the way the mechanics are, I think if we've had questions from the Zoom audience, we can answer some of those first. And then if people do have other questions after that, after our Zoom is over, the people here in person can do it. So it's almost like the Academy Awards. I see someone coming up here with a piece of paper. And so then I think this will be a question. Okay, we do have a question in. So it's a hello from HP. I don't know what that means, but congratulations on the new book. How many hours per day did Alice do her watercoloring and sketching? Whoever wants to answer, or all three.
Well, she did her watercolors upstairs in Father's room. Was it the third story or the second? The third story above the great ballroom that she has on the second story, and she could do 3 large watercolors in a day. And when she finished, she would be covered from head to toe in paint. And one day, one of her it may have been Delia, who told her, "You have to change your clothes before you come down to meet visitors." And again, I see Jonathan nodding his head because I've seen him partially covered in paint too. So.
They're good. And so then we've got another question, I think, coming in from our Zoom audience as well. So this is obviously going to be answered by someone in the family, because the question is, how is Alice viewed today by her family? We have 2 family members here and other family members in the audience. So who wants to go first?
Well, of course, when I was growing up, she was just my great aunt who took me for picnics, and I joggled on the joggling board with her and she read to me. So obviously I've learned a lot since then, that she really did quite a lot more than that. But it has, as Caroline said, we've talked a great deal about how to portray someone who was from her era, the child of wealthy rice planters, and who lived in a socially segregated society. And we've done a lot of research. We've tried to do a lot of reading about that period. And as Caroline said, she's a complicated figure like everyone else at that time. I like Jonathan Greene and I have talked about this issue, and I think he feels that while there are some who are very critical of the way she portrays plantation life, I think, as Jonathan has pointed out, it provides a rare record of actually the process of rice production step by step. And it also shows a very dignified and very skilled group of people of African descent who brought their knowing about rice production and their hard work to make those plantations possible. So I don't know, Caroline, if you want to say anything more than that about her.
I would just say her family adores her and thinks the world of her. And so we're really, really proud of the legacy she's left. And so,
I guess another thing that we've also felt is that we've really appreciated how, in a time when most women of her class and era were serving tea, she really was hardworking. She was out there in the swamps. I think it would have been difficult for her if she had had a husband and children at that time to do what she did. But she really broke some boundaries in terms of what women could do. And she mentored a lot of other women artists during her time.
On the literary side in the Renaissance, Josephine Pinckney too, a rough contemporary, slightly younger, and she did not marry because she knew if she married, she would have a husband and not a career. Mm-hmm. So I think these women did, choose that. So a few more questions, and because I read the book, I might be able to answer one of them. You mentioned her epitaph. Where is she buried? Is it Magnolia Cemetery?
She's buried at Magnolia Cemetery, and actually Charlie Jewell and I were there a few months ago, and we were with our shears because it was being overwhelmed by camellia bushes. But yes, it's in Magnolia.
And a beautiful setting, Cemetery. Certainly industry has crept up around it, but the Cooper River is right there, mm-hmm. and the great massive oaks are there as well too. So another question is, what sort of relationship did she have with Anna Haywood Taylor, who was the great woodblock printer who maybe shared, well, I won't answer the question and let some of y'all do it. May
I jump in on that one?
Sure.
She had known Anna Haywood Taylor since childhood. Taylor was a friend, a close friend of one of her first cousins. Again, they went on different paths. Taylor was able to study overseas. Alice had to stay at home because of not enough money. But Taylor steered Helen Hyde to Alice. And that was a significant thing because then Helen Hyde taught Alice about Japanese prints and opened her eyes to Japanism and gave her kind of the same platform to be on as Alston, not Alston Reed, and that led to everything.
And another technical question. Did she use gouache or body color in her watercolors, or just transparent watercolors?
It depended. She used gouache. She also used oils, mm-hmm. But she mainly used transparent watercolors, but she layered them. And when she would be working, she would have a table, and she would work around the table, and she would take these watercolor sheets, which were on large pieces of wood, and she would tilt them, and the water would run back and forth. And then once she had the background done, then she would let it dry, maybe take out portions to keep white, and then she would add in layers. And when you look at her works, often one side is wet, the other one side is dry, and that's the focal point. You want to look at the focal point, and she'll take you through the work.
Yeah, I think Whistler did the same kind of thing, is that he would have one focal point and the edges would be actually kind of abstract to pull your eye into something too.
Yes.
And so and it says, how do you see, but how do you think Alice's works, her work and place are viewed on a national scale? We love her locally, but can someone put her in the framework of the national, a national audience or a national movement?
Well, it is interesting that during her life, she had exhibits all over the country. I can't remember how many exhibits, but
a lot.
Within the 1920 to 1930, I think something like 50 different exhibits, and she went to Chicago, to New York, of course, to all over the place, and even San Francisco had one of her paintings. But I think she is, she is a local artist, and I'm not sure that she is well known, but we're hoping the book will help spread the word.
That's right. That's right. And the University of Chapel Hill did a book on art in the South, and she was the only artist from, or maybe there were two artists from South Carolina who were put forth as being on the truly professional level. So she did get critical acclaim during her lifetime, and people continue talking about her.
Yeah. And you were telepathic, because this question was she recognized nationally during her life?
Yes, she was. In fact, it's interesting because she, just another way that she was recognized, she, as you know, she didn't go to a fancy art school, and she didn't even go to college. But she was given by Mount Holyoke a doctorate degree at their 100th anniversary, because as a woman at that time, she was being honored for being professional, and she had nothing to do with Mount Holyoke. I'm not quite sure how they found her, but so she was helped spread the word, and she had relatives in Philadelphia and various parts, of course, of the South.
She was featured in the Chicago Art Institute. Bertha Jacques helped her to have not a full exhibit, but to be included in the exhibit there. Eleanor Roosevelt, when she came down here for her Southern tour, she highlighted Alice's work in her, was it My Week or My Day column, which went all over the country. And so, I mean, she was known.
Yeah. And this one might be for the researcher in the group. A viewer in Zoom land says, I think the Greenville Museum has a collection of hers. If this is the case, how did they come by them?
Martha Severance spearheaded that, I believe, because she was at the Gibbs and she was the scholar. In fact, we are all standing, we're balancing, maybe wobbling at times on Martha's shoulders. She wrote a wonderful biography, and she's been so helpful. She's been a true mentor. And I know that Dr. Lewis Wright knows and respects her as well. She serves on the board of the Wright Collection of Southern Art and in Florence, and she's someone who we all look up to. A wonderful, wonderful researcher and author.
So does anyone in the audience right now have a quick question? I see we've got another one coming up from Zoom, but and we will have time. Virginia.
I was just interested in hearing more about your father, Dwight, and how he influenced your later career.
And the question, if maybe even heard, is asking more about Dwight's father and how he impacted Miss Alice's career.
Well, thank you so much. When he came back from the war, my mother sold a piece of property she had in Myrtle Beach, and they purchased the Pink House, but Alice expedited that because Mrs. Morowitz owned it, and that took some doing. But when they got the Pink House, they established an art gallery there on Chalmers Street, and they featured the artists of the Charleston Renaissance during their last heyday. He persuaded Alice to begin painting again. There was a lull. There were lulls in Alice's life 2 or 3 times when she was either engaged in something intensively or mourning the loss of someone. And her sister, Lali, had a very painful and extended death. And so then World War II came, and for several years she did not pick up a brush. But she said, if you'll continue writing, I'll start painting. And so he did, and she did. And then after the war, of course, they were kind of in business together. And she wrote for him her reminiscences and dedicated to them in 1950. And that had a way of making her do things. And she had a way of making him do things too.
And one other quick question we have from Zoom. And you had mentioned the big wood panels that she had done inside of the house. which I guess have now been removed about it. One of the viewers wanted to know a little bit more information about that. Did she actually just paint them on the walls and then the walls were then removed from the house?
No, they actually were mahogany panels that were independent. And did birds, she did seagrasses, she did fish, all the things that kind of were around the Wando area. So no, they were not on the walls. They were independently hung there, and they're now mostly in my house up in Massachusetts.
If anyone wanted to research that further, the Gibbs Museum of Art, they have essentially notebooks that she compiled, and she did that for different folks. And you can see the images and you can see the name because she took photographs of them.
Charlie. The question is, do we know if Alice ever drew or painted an alligator? She managed to avoid them, but did she paint them?
She did. If you look on the cover of the book, and if you take a look, it's a little chopped off. You actually have to open it up a little bit. But right in the corner down there is the alligator.
You have to look really carefully.
You have to look really carefully. And the real thing that you need to do is to go over to the museum house at Middleton Place and take a closer look. And you will see the alligator in the watercolor.
Do we have any other questions? Yes, one's coming up. And again, I will say that it is an incredible book, and I did, again, the captions did direct me to go look at that image of the alligator there as well too. Like I said, it's just an exceptional book with such beauty, but with holding to such truth as well too. So this is coming from a distant relative who says, as a distant relative, I became fascinated by her work and started painting in watercolors. I have a technical question about the paper she used or treated. It doesn't seem like standard watercolor paper to get the effect she did. Did anyone answer that?
I can answer that. She used a special French paper. And again, I can't remember the name of it right now, but my mother, she bought a tablet for me when I was dabbling with watercolors. And but then she made a mistake when she did a Carolina rice plantation in the 50s. She used a thicker board, and the thicker board, the back of it was acidic. And so, when they talk about the golden haze of memory, that was a technical problem in that the pollution from what was underneath came forth and caused this golden glow to be everywhere. And it took an enormous amount of work at Harvard University to get rid of that. So the golden haze of memory is now a memory, and they're beautiful paintings. They glow, they glow. You need to go to the Gibbs, and you need to encourage them to display them all again so we can enjoy them.
Yeah, I do think there's at least one or two out now in the Renaissance Gallery, but those panels have really piqued people's interest. What were the panels done in? Were they done in oils?
Yes, they were done in oil. Yeah, they were. And yeah, they're really quite wonderful. I mean, one of them is of a huge, it's a sort of a square mahogany panel with an eagle in it. And then there are a couple with fish swimming through the seagrass, and then there were some herons that are looking at each other. But they're big, they're five feet tall, some of them.
And over the course of producing this book, I feel like we've run into a lot of distant relatives or friends in Charleston who say, I have a mahogany panel. It was given to my parents as a wedding present by Alice. So there are definitely some around Charleston.
True. And then actually one other thing just about what Dwight was saying about what kind of paper she used. When she was out in the wild, she used just old brown paper. And we have some of her work that was actually watercolor on brown paper, which is kind of fun.
So many of y'all who aren't in the Zoom, those of y'all that are in the Zoom audience were maybe not aware that we had lots of other birds come up to the door trying to get in here as well. We had a peacock trying to get in here. We had guinea hens trying to get in here as if they knew that they were somehow, related to this artist as well. And the fireproof building, I'm sure you've seen them too. they actually have panels that have been removed. I think they're beadboard that look like they've been removed from a house on, I think, Folly Beach or something like that, where again, that she's got this beautiful wash of seagulls. And it would be so interesting that you would be inside the house and you would have the aura of still being outside the house.
Mhm.
Question?
So I'm envisioning a new opportunity for us to see the mahogany panels displayed in this room.
Great
Thank you,
idea.
Ann. I know.
I know, yes, Charlie's been wonderful, you know, he'll say, oh, those are lovely, that's a lovely pair of chairs that you have, and I bet that goes back to the Middleton family, and he'll say, well, maybe we could borrow those sometime, and then suddenly about 20 years later, we sort of remember, whoa, those are still there, and I think we better just give them to Middleton Place. But Charlie actually has quite a lot of Aunt Alice's paintings of Middleton Place, several of them with his mother, Josephine, in the painting. So,
Is that the one with the big Middleton oak and the
Yes,
and the
yes.
peacock? You
Yes,
know, yeah,
exactly.
just really well done.
Beautiful.
You know, Peter Manningham, Harlan, had a number of those panels in his house on Sullivan's Island and burned down. We were all lost in the ones that have survived are there.
I have one question for everyone. So is there something about her that you would like to find out that you haven't found out, you know, that, or have you satisfied your curiosities about her? Anything that you died to know more about?
There's a lot more out there. There's a lot more out there. You know, the photographs at the Gibbs, I'm sure there are more. I couldn't afford, frankly, the time or the money to get into some of the collections because you have to pay a fee. I'm a librarian. I don't know. But in any case, I know that they're out there, and someday everything will be digitized, and then I think things will just come into place.
I wish I could meet her as an adult, because I think I'd enjoy very much understanding her and asking her some more questions and being able to also give her an appreciation, because I have a feeling that she wasn't as much appreciated by her family at the time as she should have been.
Oh, she was. She adored her brother, and her brother.
She adored her brother, and so.
We're arguing in a good way. This is how we've done with the book.
Well, I guess I never knew she was an artist, and I never was able to tell her that, but I was only 10, so maybe that explains it.
How did she happen to move to Atlantic Street with the studio from the house?
The question was, how did she manage to move from her house at 69 Church to her studio on Atlantic Street?
Well,
Not that she managed to, but
What prompted that?
Oh,
Well, my grandfather actually bought the place on Atlantic Street, and it was rented to Maud Alston Reed.
Mhm.
And Maud Alston Reed and his mother lived there until they died. And then Alice and Caroline moved there to use it as a studio.
and they did it because they wanted to continue the spirit that they had brought to that place. And in a Carolina rice plantation in the 50s, there was a very special watercolor of two herons going up into the sky. And that work was actually painted in 1926 or before, and it represents the spirits of those two people ascending into heaven. She told that to my parents.
And so you said you've not gone through everything in, or was that hyperbole? You said you've not actually gone through anything in that, everything in that magnificent trunk that you found, all those journals and.
I haven't. It's taken a long time to go through, and to do it according to Harlan standards. You know, I have to really do things correctly.
Well, I better come over and help you with that.
Right, some things might end up being on loan here, you know, at Middleton Place. Any other questions from the audience? Virginia?
just curious about any insights about Alice's relationship with her sister Caroline.
Oh, they were
very, very close.
Yes.
Yes, they were, you know, they were never married. They were just great friends. I mean, I think the way you described them, I love that. One was the Commodore. What was it?
Oh, yes. Dad called Alice the Commodore, and And Caroline, I almost said MG, was called a Major General. They were both officers together. But Caroline was kind of merciless towards Alice. One day she fainted, and Caroline was disgusted because she had sprained her ankle. She said, "This is not done in our family. We have British soldiers coming for tea." You know, so you get up and you brush it off. But in the later years, Alice took care of Caroline. Caroline's mind was beginning to fail even when Alice was there. But Alice's body was failing. And so it was a curious situation in that she lived 100. Caroline lived to be 100. Alice died 20 years before she did. But Alice was always there, and Caroline was beginning to slip.
So any other questions from anybody? If you want, if Tracy wants to call it to the conclusion, or I'd be glad to as well. And I think we should give our panelists a big round of applause.
You're the moderator.
I'd like to thank our moderator, and I'd like to thank our speakers, especially what they've done for Middleton Place Foundation. You know, they've literally given this book to Middleton Place Foundation. And I just want everyone to know that all the proceeds go to support this place, go to support the educational activities that happen here. And thank you. Calls of action. One is come out and see the exhibit in the two house museums in the Edmonton Austin House. When you see the exhibits, you'll see many of the works that you saw up on the screen tonight, plus that beautiful cover art lotus flower that we love. So please come and do that. They will be up between now and the end of the year. They go all the way until the beginning of 2020. So you have plenty of time to do it, but don't wait. And number two is buy this book. If you haven't already, it is available here at Middleton Place Museum Shop. It's also available at middletonplace.org. You can find it on our website. You can buy the book on
Tracy, you could also buy it right here and we'll sign it.
That's right. You can buy it right here. And it's also available at the Edmonton Austin House if you're downtown Charleston. You'd like to just walk by there, you can pick up a copy. It is available on Amazon, but I just want to encourage you to buy local. Buy local, and I know that all of those proceeds, and there's more proceeds if you buy here, go back to the Middleton Place Foundation. Thanks for our Zoom audience tonight. Thanks for everybody here, and have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So thanks everybody so much for joining us. We really appreciate you being here today. You're probably going to start hearing a lot of crowd noise behind me, or rather in front of me. But this concludes our Zoom program. So thank you so much. Thanks for listening. Thanks for participating, for all of your great comments and questions. And stay tuned to Middleton Place for our next wonderful Zoom occasion. If you are at all familiar with our Plugged into History program, come on back to our Facebook. We've got Lamb Cam coming soon. And check the chat window. You can find Alice Ravenel Huger Smith, Charleston Renaissance Artist, a link to buy that from our online website, and also a link for the Heron book if you're interested in that book that Caroline also mentioned. So thanks everybody. We'll see you next time. We appreciate you. Thanks for your support of Middleton Place Foundation.